You think you already know every spectacular mummy find? Well, then you should buckle up extra tight. Researchers have just recently recorded a breathtaking discovery in Egypt that will knock the socks off even the most experienced archaeologists. But what exciting finds have the experts unearthed? How do they change our view of history? And above all, what secrets still need to be brought back to light in the future? In the fall of 2020, Egypt's Minister of Antiquities, Khalid Al-Anani, announced news that resembled an archaeological fairy tale. In contrast to the brave little tailor, however, the experts in the fairy tale were not only able to rejoice over 7, but a whopping 59 in one go. The extraordinary find was made in Egypt's most famous necropolis, in the legendary necropolis of Saqqara. Here, the experts were able to recover 59 amazingly well-preserved sarcophagi. In fact, they had withstood the gnawing ravages of time so well that even their original color had been preserved. The bodies inside the coffins were in no less excellent condition. Even the most experienced Egyptologist found it difficult to put this unique sight into words. It seemed as if the mummies had only been laid to rest yesterday, and the buried were not just anyone. They were priests and officials who enjoyed an extraordinarily high reputation during their lifetime. According to initial findings, the dignitaries lived and died in the 26th dynasty, which ended around 330 BC. And although the researchers have already woken almost 60 sarcophagi from the millennia-long slumber, they are confident that this was just the start of a much bigger discovery. A few weeks earlier, the experts had already uncovered 30 ancient wooden coffins in Luxor, and when the counterparts in Saqqara were found in 3 different wells, the archaeologists also discovered 28 statues of the ancient Egyptian god Ptah and a beautiful 35-centimeter bronze statue of the deity Nefertum in the same breath. However, the name of the former owner was also inscribed on the base of this gem-studded figure. It belonged to the priest Badi Amun. The gold mummy leaves researchers speechless. I stuck my head in to see what was in the sarcophagus, and then I saw it. The beautiful mummy of a man completely covered in gold. These are the words with which the famous Egyptologist Zahi Hawass described his latest sensational discovery in Memphis. Compared to the 59 mummies from Saqqara, this find was even older. The mummy decorated with gold leaf is no less than 4,300 years old. In fact, we are dealing with the oldest known gold mummy ever. However, the title of the oldest Egyptian mummy of all time goes to another candidate that dates back to the time before pharaohs. It is an embalmed remains of a man who was buried in an embryonic position around 6,000 years ago. As for the gold mummy, we can even tell whose sparkling remains it is. A hieroglyphic inscription reveals that the dead man's name is Hecasopus. Apart from the name, however, little is known about Hecasopus' life, and yet there is no doubt that he must have been very wealthy given the sumptuous burial. Unlike so many other mummies, however, this one was not bandaged. Instead of linen cloths, the deceased appears to have been wearing a kind of tunic with a belt and large necklace when he was buried. Experts suspect that the morticians tried to preserve as much of the deceased's living appearance as possible in this way. No less significant was the discovery of another grave belonging to a man called Kanundajef, an inspector of officials. He was in the service of the pharaoh Unyaz, who probably reigned between the years 2380 and 2350 BC. In addition to the hieroglyphs that revealed this information, his tomb was also decorated with fascinating wall paintings depicting scenes from everyday life. In one painting, for example, we see 5 jugs lined up on a table. We can also see that some of the artworks were painted with elongated proportions, even though this style only became popular long after Kanumejed's lifetime. More precisely, this art epic fell into the so-called First Intermediate Period, which began around 200 years later. During this transitional period between Old and Middle Kingdoms, the region suffered from a great drought. At the same time, the Egyptian central government collapsed and the political structure underwent a profound change. The newly discovered paintings are now helping researchers to better understand the development of Egyptian art. What preserved the fetus of this pregnant mummy for thousands of years? When a mummy is already nicknamed the Mysterious Lady, it is clear that the centuries-old corpse still holds many mysteries for modern scientists. Specifically, we are dealing with the remains of a woman who died around 2,000 years ago in the ancient Egyptian city of Thebes. While the mummy was handed over to the University of Warsaw in 1826, a computed tomography examination in 2018 revealed an unexpected sensation. The mysterious lady was carrying a child under her heart at the time of her death, and the fetus was also mummified in the womb. Amazingly, over the past 2 years, the experts have succeeded in cracking 2 mysteries of the mysterious mummy. They uncovered the cause of death of the pregnant woman, and they found out the unborn child was also preserved. The result of the new series of research shows that the woman very probably fell victim to a disease that most of us consider to be more of a modern-day phenomenon. She died of cancer. By analyzing CT scans and X-ray examinations, the researchers discovered conspicuous changes in the bones of the skull and face. These, in turn, are typical of so-called nasopharyngeal cancer, a type of cancer that mainly ravages the nasopharynx and throat. And with regard to the 26 to 30-week-old fetus, the experts uncovered 2 factors that enabled its preservation for posterity: acid and salt. In the course of natural decomposition, acidification of the tissue set in after the death of the expectant mother. While the concentration of ammonia and formic acid in the blood rose, the pH level fell in the same breath. Furthermore, the body of the deceased had been embalmed with sodium bicarbonate. The inhabitants of the Pharaonic Empire used the salt to disinfect and dry out the corpse. In this way, the pregnant woman remained protected from the influence of oxygen, so the decomposition process of the body was halted. Ultimately, the fetus also remained in the untouched uterus, and according to the researchers, it could be said that it was practically pickled. This crocodile mass grave puzzles the experts. It is common knowledge that the Egyptians practiced a passionate animal cult. The inhabitants of the Pharaonic Empire worshipped a wide variety of creatures, and many of them were even mummified and buried with every conceivable honor. Crocodiles also had a very special place in the beliefs of the ancient Egyptians. They were associated with Sobek, the ruler of water and the god of fertility. With this in mind, it is no surprise for archaeologists to come across the mummified remains of armored lizards here and there. However, the experts discovered an untouched crocodile grave in the necropolis of Kubit el-Hawa. They realized on closer inspection that the reptiles had been preserved in a different way to most of their conspecifics. In detail, the 10 crocodiles had neither been treated with resin nor eviscerated, 2 steps that are actually typical for the mummification process. However, as the experts normally only recover isolated crocodile fragments, the discovery of 10 armored lizards in one go was particularly exciting. While the ancient reptiles are between 1.8 and 3.5 meters long, they appear to be 2 different species, the Nile crocodile and the West African crocodile. It is possible that the animals were initially buried in sand pits for natural preservation before they were later exhumed and brought to Kubit el-Hawa. As a rule, however, the Egyptians did not wait for the reptiles to die a natural death before making their crocodile mummies. It is therefore all the more surprising that none of the Kubit el-Hawa crocodiles show injuries that indicate a violent death. It is therefore reasonable to conclude that the animals were killed in some other way, for example by drowning, suffocation, or prolonged sunbathing. The remains of the ropes discovered on several mummies indicate that the crocodiles probably were tied up until they died of dehydration. But why were the animals sacrificed in the first place? While researchers suspect that the process was always linked to a specific purpose, in consultation with the priests, a special animal mummy was made to approximate the desired deity. In the case of the armored lizards, this was Sobek. As mentioned above, the ancient Egyptians often asked the crocodile god for fertile soil and protection from deadly reptiles. All in all, this discovery gives us new insights into the ancient Egyptian religion and the use of crocodiles as sacrificial offerings. This tomb hides fabulous treasures. If the year continues as well as it's begun for the Egyptologists, we can look forward to some truly exciting months. A few weeks ago, an Egyptian-Japanese research team discovered a tomb in Saqqara that had been carved into the rock over 4,500 years ago. Once again, a series of remarkable treasures lie dormant inside, from a child barrier from the 2nd dynasty to a well-preserved alabaster vessel from the 18th dynasty, to terracotta statues of the gods Isis and Harpocrates. The experts didn't know where to let their overwhelmed eyes wander first. The experts also uncovered the remains of a person resting next to a colorful mask. A stele with an inscription referring to a man named Heroides, several amulets, and some ostraca, that is, shards that were a cheaper alternative to papyrus, completed the fascinating find. So while the site contains several tombs and artifacts from different eras, it offers researchers invaluable insight into the history of this region.
Do we need to rethink our view of ancient Egypt? Archaeologists have uncovered a shocking discovery that proves that the brutality of the Pharaonic Empire's inhabitants knew no bounds. The creators of the pyramids did not just erect monuments for eternity, they also mutilated their enemies in a bestial manner. Mystical mortuary temples, mysterious hieroglyphs, and colossal pyramids. Among the cultures of antiquity, the ancient Egyptians enjoy an absolutely exceptional position. In view of the countless masterpieces and achievements, some people even believe that the Egyptians resorted to technologies during their civilizational rise that we would not even dare to dream of today. And yet, beyond the great admiration and awe, we should not forget that the pharaohs also had a darker side. A groundbreaking study has uncovered a cruel trophy cult that makes our blood run cold. In detail, the researchers discovered 3 separate pits in the courtyard of the ancient Egyptian Hyksos Palace at the site of Avaris. However, the pits did not contain sacred figures or precious grave gifts, but 12 severed right hands. The Hyksos Palace was built during the 15th dynasty, which is dated to between 1640 and 1530 BC. In detail, the Hyksos were a group of foreign kings who ruled Egypt during the so-called Second Intermediate Period. And while the severed body parts have been mentioned in ancient Egyptian funerary inscriptions, this is the first time the experts have found, well, solid evidence. While the researchers determined that the hands belonged to adult males, we don't know whether the amputations were performed before or after death. What is certain, however, is that the tendons and ligaments that held the bones together were completely intact after the bloody procedure. One technique for cleanly severing the hands was to cut the joint capsule and open it by cutting the tendons. If this was done correctly, there were no cut marks on the bones. This probably worked best immediately after rigor mortis. But why did the Egyptians cut off the hands of some men, and who were the pitiful victims? Well, it is very likely that we are dealing here with the body parts of defeated enemies. Furthermore, many details point to a ceremonial purpose. For one thing, the hands were found in 3 separate pits in the courtyard directly in front of the throne room. Consequently, the location was probably deliberately chosen so that it could not be overlooked. The great care with which the amputations were carried out also suggests a ritual setting. However, those who cut off the hands probably not only received fame and recognition, but also the so-called gold of honor. Some tomb and temple inscriptions indicate that the chopped-off body parts were exchanged for golden beads. The king who killed 580 people. Among researchers, Jer is known above all for one thing: his extremely long reign. While the pharaoh of the first dynasty came to power around the year 2980 BC, he was not to relinquish it for the following 54 years. Some artifacts show that Jer also introduced a number of innovations. For example, the tradition of celebrating the Horus convoy every 2 years. However, the death of the king also marked an unprecedented turning point. For when the ruler was laid to rest in Abydos, he was by no means alone. Over 318 secondary burials were discovered in the immediate vicinity of the site. However, the number of unreported cases is probably even higher, so many researchers estimate that the pharaoh was actually accompanied into the afterlife by 580 people. As these were all servants and retainers, it is impossible that they all died of natural causes. But what is the background to these mass killings, which seem so cruel and disturbing from today's perspective? Well, as the ancient Egyptians were convinced that death was not the end, the followers were killed to accompany the pharaoh and serve him in the world beyond. Perhaps the king also wanted to demonstrate his power beyond death in this way. We should not forget that the rulers of the time were worshipped as gods in human form, and the belief was that the pharaoh's right of possession applied not only in this world, but also in the afterlife. The details of the fate of the human sacrifices are disputed by researchers. On the one hand, it is conceivable that the servants voluntarily allowed themselves to be killed in order to attain eternal life or increase their status. On the other hand, it is also possible that they had no say at all and were selected and murdered against their will. The majority of the followers found so far were young men. They were around 20 years old and most probably belonged to the royal guard. The buried women were in turn servants, concubines, and wives. Alternatively, there is also the theory that the victims were chosen from the ranks of other elite families. This was intended to symbolize the unity of the group and strengthen social ties. It reinforced the belief that the sacrifice of servants contributed to the prosperity of the kingdom and demonstrated loyalty to the royal house. However, the last moments of the chosen ones' lives were anything but peaceful. They were usually strangled, poisoned, slashed, or buried alive. This sarcophagus is cursed. A little warning up front: if you're about to eat something, put your snack aside for a moment. Trust me, just do it. A few years ago, experts in Alexandria discovered a mysterious granite sarcophagus that was immediately suspected of containing an absolute sensation: the mortal remains of Alexander the Great. But as the discovery made the rounds, the rest of the population became increasingly worried. Instead of a long-lost king, the black coffin was more likely to contain a diabolical curse. And indeed, after the researchers had decided to open the sarcophagus against all warnings, they really did grimace in agony. However, this was not so much due to a demonic spell, but more to the disgusting smell that immediately filled their nostrils. The 3 skeletons inside were in a nauseating broth that literally stank to high heaven. So what do you do when you find dirty, brackish water that has been rotting for God knows how long? Right, you ask to be allowed to drink a sip of it. Unbelievable but true. In the firm belief that the mummy water has mystical powers, some people expressed the wish to have a glass of it. However, further analysis revealed that we are not dealing with a miracle potion here, but with wastewater that seeped into the coffin through cracks over time. What is this treasure chest hiding? A few years ago, archaeologists in the Deir el-Bahari necropolis made an unexpected sensational discovery: a stone chest and a wooden box, the contents of which could help solve a millennia-old mystery. While the discovery was recorded by a team from the University of Warsaw, the mysterious stone chest rested in the middle of a large pile of rubble. It was initially thought to be a simple boulder, but when the experts recognized the chest as such and opened it, they couldn't believe their eyes. The approximately 3,500-year-old artifact concealed several surprising objects, all carefully wrapped in linen cloth. In total, the stone chest contained 3 bundles. One contained the skeleton of a goose, which had most likely been sacrificed for religious purposes. The second apparently contained the goose's egg, while the last also contained an egg, which probably came from an ibis. Not far from the stone chest, the researchers recovered a small wooden jewelry box in the shape of an ancient Egyptian mortuary chapel. The special feature: this casket bore the name of the pharaoh Thutmose II. All in all, the name and the symbolism of the finds indicate that the discovery is directly linked to the royal house. What's more, the royal deposit suggests that a previously unknown pharaoh's tomb lies dormant in the immediate vicinity. The recovered objects literally scream that Thutmose II himself was buried here, although the exact location of his tomb has been lost for thousands of years. While the pharaoh was only in power for 3 years, he died at the age of 16. Prior to this, he had married his own sister Hatshepsut, a union that was anything but unusual at the time. However, It seems that Hatshepsut completely dominated her brother and he never really ruled himself. In the end, she became the first female pharaoh in history and ruled for almost 22 years. 801 go. Every time archaeologists in Egypt uncover a new tomb, their joy is boundless. But how great must the cries of joy be when they uncover 800 tombs in one go? In fact, this longing dream of every Egyptologist should come true in 2018. The gigantic cemetery is located between two pyramids near El Lisht, 60 kilometers south of Cairo. And although the tombs are no longer recognizable above ground today, the experts were able to reconstruct their original appearance. According to the reconstruction, the tombs had roofs, and there were even causeways leading to the nearby riverbank. For the researchers, the discovery opens an important door to the past. The graves allow them to learn more about the different groups of people who lived in Ichtawi 4,000 years ago. This is the city that Amenemhet I declared the capital in the 2nd millennium BC. And although Ichtawi was probably located near the discovered cemetery, its exact location is still unknown. While the Middle Kingdom is often overshadowed by the Old and New Kingdoms, this era is of particular interest to experts. This era embodied a heyday of art and culture, and it was also the time when the god of the dead, Osiris, attained a prominent position. As only a few royal tombs had previously been discovered in the region, the tombs, in which the most diverse members of society rest, reveal unprecedented information about the broad population of the Middle Kingdom.
How is it possible that ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs represent modern helicopters? Were the pyramids really just gigantic pharaonic tombs? And how were the ancients able to move loads that even our most advanced machines can't? Hardly any other people have left as many mysteries for posterity as the ancient Egyptians. And although the era of the pharaoh's empire has been over for many centuries, it seems that their deepest secrets are now only coming to light. Is it possible that the Egyptians had advanced technologies that were vastly superior to ours? What's more, is the evidence for this incredible fact right under our noses? Or to put it another way, how could the ancient Egyptians depict something that they didn't know what it looked like, or that it even existed? There are those who believe that the texts in our history books have absolutely nothing to do with historical reality. This is primarily due to the fact that many ancient Egyptian buildings raise more questions than answers. The mysterious Abydos hieroglyphs are often consulted in this regard. But is it possible that the mortuary temple of Sethos I shows us technologies that were actually developed thousands of years later? Well, this is exactly what the Ancient Astronaut Society group discovered when they investigated the site in the 1990s. And indeed, the facts that the symbols are reminiscent of helicopters, submarines, and battle tanks cannot be denied. So is this incontrovertible proof of pre-astronautics? The followers of this parascientific movement are convinced that the peoples of antiquity were regularly visited by extraterrestrials. The astonished inhabitants of Earth worshipped their exotic visitors as supernatural gods and adopted some of their technologies. However, it is in the nature of things that mainstream historians interpret the Abydos hieroglyphs somewhat differently. According to them, we do not see flying machines and war machines here, but the so-called Nebti and throne names of two pharaohs. Initially, the royal titles of Sethos I were immortalized here. Later, part of the inscription were covered with plaster and replaced by the names of Sethos' son, Ramses II. The fact that the symbols are the subject of fierce debate today is again due to the fading paint and crumbling plaster. As a result, they are the result of unplanned visual mixtures that have nothing to do with the original design. For example, the helicopter is made up of characters for bow, flapping arm, quail chick, and arm, while the supposed submarine actually means mouth, arm, and basket. The main battle tank is based on the hieroglyphs for hand and half. You've definitely never heard of these two giants. But speaking of tanks, unexpectedly, there is actually a parallel between modern combat vehicles and the ancient structures of the Egyptians: the weight. The German Army's Leopard 2, for example, weighed 64 tons. The rose granite blocks used in the Pyramid of Cheops are similarly heavy, although some of them even break the 80-ton mark. And perhaps we should remind ourselves at this point that the sources on the transportation and construction techniques of the ancient Egyptians are sparse, to say the least. However, the rose granite obviously had a very special significance for them. After all, it was brought from the quarries of Aswan, 800 kilometers away. Of course, transportation was by no means the end of the story. Hundreds of these massive blocks were then used in the Great Gallery and the so-called King's Chamber. So, it is no wonder that the question of the techniques involved in this undertaking is a source of great confusion. But I bet you didn't know the following. Compared to the loads the Egyptians used elsewhere, the rose granite blocks of the Great Pyramid look like puny Lego bricks. For example, have you ever heard of the Colossi of Memnon? Located near the legendary Valley of the Kings, the two statues bear their name quite rightly. While the Colossi still tower around 18 meters today, they weigh around 720 tons. In other words, they are almost 10 times heavier than the heaviest blocks of the Great Pyramid. But that's not all. The giants were also carved from a single colossal stone. Adult humans look like ants next to these giants, but that's not the only mystery surrounding the Memnon Colossi. Just as in the case of the rose granite of the pyramids, the sandstone used also comes from a distant region. And once again, the question arises as to how the Egyptians managed to transport such massive loads over a distance of more than 630 kilometers. Is this proof of a lost technology? However, this is where things start to get really interesting. Despite their imposing dimensions, the Colossi of Memnon are not the largest statues the Egyptians created. Not even close. The Ramesseum, the temple built by Ramses II in Thebes West, houses the remains of a pharaonic statue that is one of the heaviest monoliths ever created and transported in history. And once again, the colossal structure was hewn from a single stone, while at the same time weighing an incredible 1,000 tons. And once again, the necessary material had to be brought from Aswan, which in this case was a good 185 kilometers away. But leaving aside the realization of this mammoth task for a moment, what on earth caused the stone giant to be so badly damaged? In view of the fact that the statue once sat stable and did not stand upright, it is difficult to imagine that an earthquake brought it to its knees. The only thing that is certain is that the forces that broke the giant into its individual parts must have been enormous. In order to understand how spectacular and mysterious the works of the ancient Egyptians really were, we should briefly take a look at the present day. The Belaz 75710 holds the title of being the heaviest series-produced dump truck in the world. While the total mass of the vehicle is 810 tons, its payload is 410 tons. But even though you have to climb 2 flights of stairs to reach the cab, and even though the tires are as high as an African bull elephant, the dump truck couldn't even have transported half of the Ramesseum statue. Not even 4,664 horsepower can help. But how did the inhabitants of antiquity manage something that even the most powerful machines of our time would have failed at? Well, for the slightly more alternative circles, the answer to the question is obvious. The ancient Egyptians must have possessed sophisticated technology that mainstream historians don't want to talk about. You're still skeptical? Well, that's perfectly understandable, but that's precisely why you should listen extra carefully now. This modern project challenges historiography. In 2012, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art created an installation called Levitated Mass. While the free-floating mass weighs a considerable 340 tons, the 6.55-meter-high boulder first had to be transported to LA from the Jurupa Valley Quarry 170 kilometers away. And to accomplish this, a specially designed truck had to be built around the rock. And here's the thing, the vehicle was 80 meters long, 9.75 meters wide, and had 196 wheels. During transportation, the XXL truck crept along the roads at 6 kilometers an hour. In total, the transfer took 11 night trips and $10 million. The The press described the operation as the largest of its kind since the construction of the Egyptian pyramids. And as a reminder, the levitated mass is not even half as heavy as the two colossi of Memnon. And despite this, the statues were moved hundreds of years ago over a distance that was significantly greater. Not to mention the giant that adorns the Ramesseum. This one is actually 3 times heavier than the modern art installation. And we have absolutely no idea how the inhabitants of the Pharaonic Empire managed to move loads of this magnitude. But let's get this straight. The alternative circles are not claiming that the Egyptians did not use human labor at all to move the blocks of stone. Of course they did. There is an illustration showing dozens of workers pulling a statue over wooden sledges. However, this statue was significantly smaller than those depicted, and it weighed only 64 tons. In addition, the load in the scene depicted was only transported over a very short distance. With this in mind, the question arises as to whether the wooden sledges could have withstood loads of 720 or even 1,000 tons. And even if they hadn't broken immediately, how would the extreme weights have been placed on them in the first place? Some researchers believe it is likely that the Nile was an important transportation artery for the Egyptians' construction projects. In reality, however, there is no reliable evidence to support this theory. We know of no ancient Egyptian ship that would have been capable of transporting such massive components from A to B. Conversely, this does not mean that the Egyptians did not transport lighter blocks across the Nile. This is documented firsthand, above all in the so-called Papyrus Jaf A and B. But compared to the massive rose granite blocks of the Great Pyramid, the blocks used in the construction of the mastabas and surrounding buildings are peanuts. Moreover, we should not forget that the quarry from which the material came is less than 15 kilometers from the Giza Plateau. But even if the Egyptians had brought the blocks for the Colossi of Memnon and the Rasmussen statue across the Nile, they would have had to travel against the current, because the Nile flows from south to west. So how likely is it that legions of ordinary men transported 1,000 tons hundreds of kilometers? Or is this assumption merely the result of widespread illustrations that have no solid basis? Whether we will ever find a clear answer to this controversial question is still written in the stars. But isn't it precisely this uncertainty that makes dealing with this topic so exciting?
Who were the ancient Egyptians really? Did the inhabitants of the Pharaonic Empire really build their monuments using only simple tools and pure muscle power? Or did the Egyptians know technologies that we can't even dream of today? Well, one thing is undisputed. There are countless ancient Egyptian artifacts that cannot easily be placed in a logical context. What's more, some finds are so unusual and controversial that the public shouldn't even get to see them. Could the ancient Egyptians see into the future? Did someone travel back in time to ancient times? Or did the Egyptians possess futuristic high-tech machines that easily outshone even our own? Hardly any other ancient culture is so suspected of not having been what our history books tell us it was. But what is this assumption all about? How do some people come up with the idea that the Egyptians were actually much more advanced than mainstream historians would have us believe? Well, such hypotheses are based above all on the strange discoveries that were already made in ancient Egypt. Just think of the mysterious light bulbs of Dendera. While the corresponding reliefs are located in the eponymous Hathor Temple of Dendera, they divide the public into 2 camps. Conservative researchers say that all we are seeing here is the Egyptian creation myth. However, the alternative opposing side recognizes in the bubble-shaped containers not the womb of the sky goddess Nut, but fully functional electric lamps. And what about the enigmatic hieroglyphs that adorn the mortuary temple of Sethos I in Abydos? In fact, we see extremely strange structures here that look like airplanes and helicopters. But how is this possible? How could the Egyptians even know what such technologies looked like or how they worked? But that's not all. A battle tank and a submarine are also said to have crept into the Abydos hieroglyphs. Well, that was the conclusion reached by the Ancient Astronaut Society group, which discovered the symbols in the middle of the so-called Apparition Hall in the 1990s. The team interpreted the images as indisputable proof of pre-astronautics. In other words, the Egyptians were in regular contact with extraterrestrial intelligences. While these were worshipped as divine beings by the inhabitants of the Pharaonic Empire, they revealed advanced knowledge to the inhabitants of Earth that made the construction of the pyramids and the like possible in the first place. However, it comes as no surprise that the long-established Egyptologists interpret the Abydos hieroglyphs somewhat differently. According to them, the inscription originally referred to the so-called Nebti and the throne name of the pharaoh Sethi. The translation would have been as follows: the Nebti name, born again with mighty sword destroying the 9 bows, and the throne name, King of Upper and Lower Egypt, Lord of both lands, enduring is the world order of Re. Parts of the inscription were later covered with plaster and replaced with the name of Ramses II. However, as the bright colors faded over time and the plaster crumbled from the stone, the older hieroglyphs reappeared. So what looks like a modern helicopter is actually a combination of the original sign for bow and the later hieroglyphs for striking arm, quail chick, and arm. The supposed battle tank comes from the hieroglyphic mixture of hand and half. The submarine is actually a mixture of arm and basket. Of course, the other side is not so easily fobbed off with the crumbling plaster theory. Fortunately, however, there was someone who knew all about the secrets of the Abydos temple. A woman who claimed to be a reincarnated temple priestess and possessed an inexplicable knowledge of the site. I had a relationship with Sethos Gur. Of course, there are many weirdos, people who invent the wildest stories to get their 15 minutes in the spotlight. But we can't make it quite that simple in the case of Dorothy Eady, because although her accounts couldn't be more outlandish, it would appear that she knew something that she couldn't actually know. Born in London in 1904 and died in Al Araba Al Madfuna, Egypt, in 1981, it all began when 3-year-old Dorothy fell down the stairs and suffered a life-threatening injury. Afterwards, she was haunted by mysterious dreams and visions and kept asking her parents to finally bring her home. It was only when Dorothy visited the British Museum with her family and saw a photo of the Abydos temple there that she claimed to have arrived with her people. Later, the British woman intensively studied the ancient Egyptian language and culture and eventually converted to the ancient Egyptian religion. In the end, she became a technical draftswoman for Egypt's highest monument protection authority and researched the mortuary temple of Sethos I from the 1950s onwards. And given that she had already spent most of her earlier life here, this step seems only logical. Unbelievable, but true. During a spiritual session in which Dorothy contacted her past self, she wrote down her story in perfect ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. The symbols said that thousands of years ago she was a girl called Bentrashit who grew up as an orphan in the temple. There she became a priestess herself and also met King Sethos I. The following claims show that this was much more than a fleeting encounter. Dorothy, or Bentrashit, had entered into a forbidden love affair with the pharaoh and became pregnant by him. However, as she knew that pregnancy was tantamount to a death sentence, she took her own life. That's right, and then she woke up. But wait, Dorothy is later said to have possessed extraordinary knowledge about the temple. She was able to locate the ruins of the lost temple garden, which no archaeologist had ever discovered before. She also knew the position of old tunnels and tombs, and she knew the exact location of temple paintings that had not even been published at the time. Despite her, well, let's say idiosyncratic claims, Dorothy Eady's scientific publications were never questioned. Is this proof of the lost technologies? Can you remember your history teacher telling you that the stone blocks of the ancient Egyptians were so precise that not even a sheet of paper would have fit between them? Just a quick glance at the Pyramid of Khufu is enough to realize that the Egyptians created their architectural masterpieces on a grand scale. The huge monument consists of an estimated 2.65 million stone blocks. And indeed, some of the ancient relics still bear witness to the incredible skills the Egyptians possessed. The individual stones fit together so perfectly that we can't even tell where one block ends and another begins. However, it is not only the precision that makes the ancient Egyptian buildings so impressive, but also their sheer size. Let's just take a look at the Valley Temple of King Khafre. Located near the Great Sphinx, many of the site's rose granite blocks weigh more than 30 tons. And yet the massive individual pieces were put together so perfectly that they look like an oversized jigsaw puzzle. Even grown men look like puny tots in front of the impressive blocks. But that's not all. The building material, which weighed several tons, was also transported from a location no less than 800 kilometers away from the Giza Plateau. But how was this even possible with the resources of the time? Well, according to conventional historians, the Egyptians used ships to transport the cargo across the Nile. However, there is a big catch to this assumption. Even the largest ancient Egyptian ships that have been rediscovered so far would never have been able to withstand such loads. But now back to the outstanding precision of the blocks. In some places, it looks as if they were cut using a kind of laser technology and then fused together. But how did the Egyptians master this challenging task? Well, the question of how the inhabitants of the Pharaonic Empire were able to drill and saw rocks such as basalt and granite is one of the most perplexing of all. After all, they needed a material that was at least as hard as quartz. It is assumed that copper saws were used in combination with a mixture of water, gypsum, and quartz sand. And even though this may well have been possible, we can all agree that it was extremely strenuous work that took an enormous amount of time. And against this background, a fundamental question arises. Why should the Egyptians have continued to work for hours if the block was no longer usable anyway, due to a fault? What this is all about becomes clear when you look at the following stone block. Exhibited in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, it is said to be nothing more than a stone mishap. In other words, the worker distorted the cut, rendering the block unusable. But why did he continue sawing for so long? Did he really only realize his mistake so late? At this point, we should not forget one thing. In order to check the effectiveness of the supposed techniques, some Egyptologists decided to put them to the practical test. And while the two men struggled with their saws, they penetrated a full 4 millimeters per hour into the rock. So how many hours would the ancient Egyptians have had to continue sawing before they realized that they had made a mishap? For some people, the examples presented lead to a hotly disputed conclusion. The methods used by the inhabitants of the Pharaonic Empire were never as primitive as is claimed today. They had technologies at their disposal that made it possible to carve the massive blocks of stone in no time at all. Where the historical devil is in the detail, we would have to acknowledge that we have been on the wrong track for many centuries. But could it be that this controversial assumption also coincides with reality? Well, who knows? Perhaps the proof is still lying dormant somewhere in the hot desert sands. But whether we will get to see it one day is another matter entirely.
Can you imagine that Egypt hides a portal that defies the laws of space and time? A mystical portal that can transport you several millennia into the past. Were the ancient Egyptians really as simple-minded as mainstream historians claim? Or could the Pharaoh's empire dwellers perform true marvels we can't even dream of today? Stay tuned and join us in unraveling the mystery of the fabled time travel gate from ancient Egypt. The Portal of Abydos. When we think of famous ancient Egypt necropolises, the first images that come to mind are those of the legendary necropolis of Saqqara. However, we must not forget one thing at this point. Abydos was also one of the most important necropolises of the country. About 160 kilometers away from Luxor, the pharaohs of the First Dynasty started their journeys to the afterlife here. And they did not do this alone. Sometimes a ruler was buried with 300 of his servants and followers, who were apparently killed for this purpose. One particular structure of Abydos, in turn, is suspected of housing a supernatural gateway that opens the door to an unimaginable world. The Temple of the Dead of Sethos I. To make the mystery perfect, the site is also adorned by strange carvings that Egyptologists cannot explain. Since such images do not appear in any known temple, the way is paved for the most exciting theories and speculations. And indeed, the more alternative circles are convinced that they have finally cracked the riddle of the mystical Stargate. So much in advance, at this point it becomes extremely controversial. But let's try to approach this exciting topic as openly as possible. The Temple of Abydos was the home of the Order of Melchizedek. This is a mythical king and priest mentioned in the Bible. But that's not all. Some people believe that Melchizedek's followers possessed unimaginable knowledge and even predicted the appearance of Jesus Christ, among other things. If one follows history, the roots of the priesthood go back to the dawn of mankind. The task of the order was to free people from their illusions and to break the chains of earthly enslavement. As the founders of the ancient mystery schools, the Melchizedek priests were known to possess knowledge of the cosmos and the key to the ascension of humanity. And they were the guardians of the portal in the Abydos temple. Incredible claims. Because of their magnificent buildings, their spiritual rituals, and their unique cult of the dead, the ancient Egyptians have long been suspected of having been different. This means the historical reality had in truth nothing to do with the texts, which were written in our history books. Sometimes there is talk of a submerged, highly developed precursor culture, which made the civilizational rise of the Egyptians possible in the first place. Others are convinced that the inhabitants of the Pharaonic Empire possessed sophisticated technologies that were vastly superior to ours, and whose mode of operation is completely alien to us. Last but not least, there is the alien theory. The ancients were regularly visited by extraterrestrial intelligences, which in turn were worshipped as divine beings. The advocates of such are convinced that the governments and authorities know exactly about their correctness. However, they try everything to maintain the common historical picture. But fortunately, there are one or two insiders who are a bit more willing to talk. For example, the alternative scene often refers to unnamed sources who have direct insight into the hidden machinations. So also in the case of the Abydos portal, from secret insider circles it had leaked out that a natural stargate is here, which was used in the context of a covert military experiment to send an extraterrestrial home. That such assertions sound extremely far-fetched, we do not need to emphasize at this point. But are there any clues that make this story more than a wacky fantasy? Hidden clues. The portal is said to be located on one of the north walls of the temple. There, military insiders used some sort of projection device, as well as a barrel and a series of containment rings to open the stargate with a directed electromagnetic energy force and cause a distortion of space and time. Even for those whom this story sounds way too wacky could see for themselves that the mortuary temple of Sethos I hides an unfathomable secret. To do so, they would only have to take a closer look at an extraordinary carving on the interior wall, which at first seems completely inconspicuous. On closer inspection, however, we recognize a pharaoh pulling a sled-like vehicle with wings. The particular vehicle again has 4 posts with gates and a barrel-shaped ring device representing the 2 heads of the falcon god, Sokar. On the wing, we again find a strange creature with unusual ears. Some associate the creature with the so-called Seth beast, a being that controls the chaotic forces of nature. To the left of the pharaoh is Thoth. This figure, sometimes depicted with an ibis head and sometimes with a baboon head, was considered by the Egyptians to be the god of the moon, magic, science, and wisdom. And on the corresponding wall carving, he seems to instruct the human king. The powers of the deity were considered so formidable that the Egyptians told of the Book of Thoth. Any person who read this supernatural writing could become the most powerful magician in the world. It was said that the book contained the secrets of the gods and revealed everything hidden in the stars. And if anyone could make such a book, it was Thoth. He was considered not only the master scribe of the gods, but also the being who made the legendary Tabula Smaragdina. This is said to be a mysterious emerald tablet that reveals the hidden forces of the cosmos and served as the basic text of alchemy. A journey into the past. Of course, the more creative minds were neither the first nor the only ones to look at a wall carving. Conservative researchers assume that the scene is closely related to ancient Egyptian mythology. It shows us how the soul of the pharaoh passes through the ascension gate and passes into the afterlife. And yet, the whole truth seems to have been lost in the course of time. It appears that a rather large piece of the wall was once removed. The gnawing tooth of the time, or nevertheless, a deliberate concealment. Whatever the case, what was visible on the missing piece is possibly forever written in the stars. However, things look a bit different when we look at the unbelievable report of a woman named Dorothy Eady. She claimed to have accidentally fallen into the time travel portal herself. However, this is by no means the only story with which the Englishwoman attracted attention. So Eady was not only the keeper of the mortuary temple of Sethos I, but also rock solidly convinced to have been a priestess in exactly that sanctuary in a former life. But this is not enough. In this function, she would have led us to still another forbidden relationship with Sethos I. But when Eady, who is called Bentreshit in ancient Egypt, became pregnant, she ended her life to escape execution. Incredible but true. Although Eady's claims were dismissed by most as absolute bullshit, she possessed an extraordinary knowledge of the Temple of Abydos. In fact, she could even locate the remains of the lost temple garden and knew the exact positions of ancient tunnels and tombs that had not even been published at the time. After her unexpected trip into the dimensional hole, which was accompanied by a visual journey into the past, Eady is said to have been repeatedly pressing her hands longingly against the walls of the temple, searching for the hidden gate. Myth and science. But what does the scientific community actually have to say about the concept of time travel? Well, the startling news first. Time travel is possible. However, not in the way we see it in Hollywood movies, and even then, only into the future. Well, at least in theory. The effect of time dilation causes all internal processes of the physical system to run slower when this system moves relative to the observer. To better understand this unwielding definition, it is worth taking a look at the so-called twin paradox. A twin flies to a distant star at close to the speed of light, while his brother remains behind on Earth. Afterwards, the twin returns at the same speed and is amazed to find that he has aged less than his brother. But what about the reverse case? Are journeys into the past really possible? Well, not necessarily. It is theoretically conceivable that a black hole and a white hole together can form a wormhole. In other words, the matter that falls into the black hole is ejected again in another part of the cosmos or in another universe. This is true both spatially and temporally, including the past. And although white holes and wormholes embody mathematical solutions to the equations of general relativity, the exciting mind game has a big catch. So far, the actual existence of such entities has not been proven. The looking glass. Where Einstein's theories have had their day, the secret technology of the looking glass comes into play. As briefly mentioned earlier, the military is said to have managed to open the Abydos porthole. This is said to have been achieved by using the looking glass, which is also known as the Yellow Book or Orion's Cube. This would be an alien technology recovered in 1947 during the infamous Roswell incident in New Mexico. With special emphasis on the little word allegedly, the ominous device was then given to Dwight D. Eisenhower, so it has been in the possession of the US government ever since. The bottom line is that the looking glass could not only open dimensional and time travel portals, but also provide information about future events. Eisenhower, for example, had seen which men would take over the presidency after him, and the attacks of September 11, 2001 were also among the gloomy glimpses of the future. However, the images projected onto a holographic screen would merely be the most likely future. I wonder if the US politicians also saw that you now press the like and subscribe button to never miss a new video again.